Off the coast of Florida in July of 1715, a hurricane drives 11 Spanish ships onto a reef, spilling silver by the ton across shallow water. At almost the same moment, in ports from Bristol to Port Royal, thousands of sailors and privateers are standing on docks with no ship to sail. 2 years earlier, in 1713, the great powers of Europe signed a peace that ended more than a decade of war, and the war that had employed them was over. The men with the skill to fight a ship and the training to navigate one now had nothing to do with either. These two events, a wrecked treasure fleet and an unemployed navy, are about to collide in a harbour in the Bahamas that no government controls. Over the next 12 years, that collision will produce a fleet of captains who vote for their leaders, an island with no king, and a black flag that will terrify the Atlantic before the crown that made them hunts every one of them down. This is the golden age of piracy, how it was built, how it worked, and why it could not last. In April of 1713, in the Dutch city of Utrecht, the great powers of Europe put their names to a stack of treaties that ended the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that had run for more than a decade over who would sit on the Spanish throne. The fighting stopped. The fleets that had fought it did not simply vanish, they were paid off. Britain alone released tens of thousands of sailors from the Royal Navy in a single year, and thousands more privateers, men who had held a legal license to raid enemy shipping for profit, lost that license the moment the enemy stopped being an enemy. These were not unskilled men. Many could handle a ship in a gale, read a chart, aim a cannon, and follow an order under fire. What they could not do in the peace that followed was find work that paid anything close to what raiding had paid. Merchant vessels wanted crews, but at wages a fraction of a privateer's share under captains who could flog a man for talking back. Along the docks of Bristol, Port Royal and Boston, a class of men existed in 1713 who had every skill a pirate would need, and no legal way to use any of it. 2 years later, on a July night in 1715, a hurricane caught the Spanish treasure fleet, 11 ships heavy with silver coin bound from Havana to Cadiz, strung out along the reefs of the Florida coast. The storm drove every one of them onto shallow water. More than 1,000 sailors drowned. The ships broke apart and their cargo, chests of minted silver reels, known across the Atlantic as pieces of 8, spilled across the seafloor in water shallow enough to dive for it by hand. Spain moved fast, setting up a salvage camp on the coast with divers and soldiers to recover what they could, and for a while they recovered a great deal. Word of an unguarded fortune sitting in 5 fathoms of water travels quickly among idle sailors. Within weeks, English wreckers out of Jamaica, men who made a living picking apart shipwrecks along a coastline that produced them constantly, arrived to see what the Spanish camp had already pulled up. One of them, a Jamaican privateer named Henry Jennings, did not wait for an invitation. Jennings led a raid on the Spanish salvage camp itself in December of 1715, landing armed men who overpowered the small garrison, and made off with roughly 350,000 pieces of 8 already recovered and stacked ashore. It was not subtle theft, it was closer to an open act of war against a nation Britain was on paper at peace with, and Jennings knew it. He could not sail that silver into a British port and expect the authorities to look away. What Jennings needed was a harbour with no authority to look away in the first place. He knew of one. New Providence Island in the Bahamas held a town called Nassau that had once flown the English flag, but a joint French and Spanish raid in 1703 had burned its fort and driven off what little government existed, and London had never bothered to rebuild it. No governor sat there. No customs officer inspected a ship's hold. No court could try a man for anything. It was, in the plainest sense, a harbour that belonged to whoever anchored in it longest. Jennings sailed his stolen silver there, and he was not alone in choosing it. Other captains who had raided the same wrecks, or simply heard what a hurricane and a war's end had made possible, followed him in. A war that trained an army of skilled, idle sailors had ended at exactly the moment a hurricane handed them a fortune and a lawless harbour to spend it in. Both forces had been building for years, entirely apart from each other. In the winter of 1715, in a burned-out town on a Bahamian island, they met. By the start of 1716, Nassau was no longer a wrecker's hideout. It was becoming something closer to a town, if a town can exist with no government at all. Estimates from the period, imprecise but consistent across several accounts, put the population of armed men living around the harbour at close to 1,000 within a year or two, a number that would have made it one of the larger settlements in the English Caribbean, larger than many towns that did have a governor and a church. It had neither. The old fort's walls stood broken and unmanned. No minister held services. What Nassau had instead was a beach shallow enough to careen a ship, meaning to run it aground deliberately at high tide, so the hull could be scraped clean of the worm-eaten wood and barnacle growth that slowed every wooden vessel in tropical water, and a harbour deep enough behind it to shelter dozens of sloops at once. For men who lived by outrunning the Royal Navy, a place to keep a fast hull fast was worth more than any fort. The men who ran Nassau, to the extent anyone ran it, were not a single organisation with a single leader. They were a loose, shifting alliance of captains who came to be known, later as the Flying Gang, a name that stuck because their sloops moved fast and struck without warning up and down the shipping lanes between Florida, Cuba, and the Bahama Channel. Henry Jennings was among the earliest of them. Another was Benjamin Hornigold, an Englishman who had turned to open piracy after the same war's end left him, like so many others with no legal outlet for his skills. Hornigold ran a strict enough crew that he held to one private rule even after crossing fully into piracy. He refused for a time to attack English ships, preferring French and Spanish targets, a scruple that would eventually cost him his command. What made Nassau function without a government was not chaos, though it looked like chaos to any naval officer who saw it from a distance. It functioned because the men living there had brought their own systems of order with them, systems built during years of privateering and naval service, and adapted those systems to a life with no crown above them. Disputes over plunder, over a captain's conduct, over who owed whom a share, were settled by vote among the crew rather than by an officer's word, because the alternative, a captain who could not be checked, was exactly the abuse. Many of these men had fled the Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy to escape. A captain in Nassau held his post at his crew's pleasure, and a crew that lost confidence in a captain could, and did, simply choose another one at the next opportunity. It was an informal system, unwritten in any single Nassau charter, but it was consistent enough across different crews that visitors and captives alike described the same pattern. Men who had walked away from institutions that flogged them for insubordination building, almost by instinct, institutions that could not flog anyone without their consent. Into this loose alliance, sometime around 1716, Benjamin Hornigold took on a new crew member, a large, physically imposing sailor of uncertain earlier history who went by the name Edward Teach. Little is reliably known of Teach's life before Nassau. Historians generally place his birth in Bristol or nearby, and his early service aboard a privateer during the recent war, but nothing about his career before this point survives in solid record. What is certain is that Hornigold, recognizing ability when he saw it, gave Teach command of a sloop taken in one of the Flying Gang's raids. Within 2 years, the name Edward Teach would mean almost nothing to the wider world, and the name he adopted instead would mean almost everything. Before a Flying Gang crew put out to sea under a new captain, the men gathered usually below deck or ashore around a fire, and put a document in front of themselves that historians now call the ship's articles. Different crews wrote different versions, but the pattern across surviving copies, taken from trial records and captives' later testimony, is remarkably consistent. Each man signed his name or made his mark, sometimes swearing on a Bible where one existed, sometimes on a hatchet or a pistol where it did not, and in doing so bound himself to terms the whole crew had already argued out and agreed on. The captain was elected by the crew's vote. He held absolute authority only in battle, when hesitation could sink the ship. The rest of the time, decisions on where to sail and whom to attack were put to a vote as well. A separate officer, the quartermaster, was also elected, and his job was specifically to check the captain's power, to divide plunder fairly, to hear grievances, and in some crews to have the final say on discipline even over the captain's objection. A captain who grew too greedy, too cruel, or too cowardly could be removed by a vote of the crew at any time, and frequently was. The articles went further than governance. Most set out exactly how plunder would be shared. The captain and quartermaster typically took 1.5 to 2 shares, other officers a share and a quarter or so, and ordinary crew members 1 share each, a spread far narrower than the gulf between an officer's pay and a common sailor's pay in the Royal Navy. Many crews wrote in a form of compensation for injury. A wounded man who lost his right arm might be guaranteed a fixed sum out of the plunder, before shares were divided among everyone else, and the loss of an eye or a finger carried its own set payment, a rough but real insurance scheme that no merchant or naval employer of the period offered a common sailor at all. Gambling was frequently banned aboard. since debts and grudges over cards had a way of turning into knife fights in cramped quarters. Lights and candles below deck after a certain hour were often forbidden as well. Both a fire risk aboard a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder and a way of keeping drunkenness from getting out of hand. None of this made pirate crews gentle, and none of it was philosophy for its own sake. It was practical. Men who had served under Royal Navy officers where a captain's word was near absolute, and a sailor could be flogged, or worse, for questioning an order, and who had served under merchant captains who could shortchange a crew's wages with almost no recourse, built a system that closed off exactly those grievances, because the men writing the rules had lived under the alternative and knew precisely which abuses they refused to repeat. Historians studying these documents have noted how closely the balance of power in a ship's articles resembles the balance many of these same men had wanted and been denied in the navies and merchant fleets they came from. It was not an accident that a document written by former sailors, for former sailors, gave the crew a vote. This system held together well enough while the flying gang's captains largely agreed on targets and stayed loosely allied. It began to fracture over the very question Hornigold had drawn a line at: which ships were fair game? Hornigold's refusal to attack English vessels, a holdover loyalty from his privateering days, put him increasingly at odds with a crew grown hungry for easier prizes closer to home, English merchantmen among them. In 1717 that disagreement came to a vote, the same mechanism that had elected him, and the crew removed Hornigold from command. Command of that vessel and its crew passed instead to the man Hornigold himself had promoted from an ordinary hand, the sloop captain named Edward Teach, who by then had already begun cultivating the look and the reputation that would make him the most feared name on the Atlantic. Once free of Hornigold's command in late 1717, Edward Teach moved quickly to build a force no single navy patrol in the Caribbean could easily challenge. His opportunity came that November, when his small fleet captured a large French slave ship named La Concorde off the island of Martinique. Teach kept the vessel for himself, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, and set about converting it into the most heavily armed pirate ship then sailing, eventually mounting around 40 cannon, a broadside heavier than most naval vessels the Royal Navy stationed in American waters at the time. With a crew that grew past 300 men across his combined ships, Teach commanded, briefly, something closer to a small private navy than a single raiding sloop. He also built a reputation deliberately, and the reputation did much of his fighting for him. Contemporary accounts describe a tall, heavily bearded man who wove slow-burning fuse cord into his beard and hair before boarding a captured ship so that smoke curled around his face in the moment his victims got their first look at him. He wore multiple pistols and a cutlass visibly, cultivating an appearance meant to look less like a man and more like a threat given a name, Blackbeard, that the merchant captains of the Atlantic would come to fear on sight of his flag alone. The strategy worked in the way that mattered most to Teach. Most of the vessels he approached surrendered without a shot fired, once their crews recognized who was closing on them. A reputation frightening enough that people surrender their cargo without a fight is, from a raider's point of view, more valuable than any cannon, because it costs nothing and risks nothing. In May of 1718, Teach brought this combined fleet to the harbour of Charleston in the colony of South Carolina and blockaded it outright, anchoring across the main channel and stopping every ship that tried to enter or leave for close to a week. He captured several vessels in the harbour's approach, including one carrying prominent Charleston citizens, and used those hostages as leverage, sending a demand ashore that the town supply him with a chest of medicine likely needed for venereal disease or dysentery running through his crew in exchange for the hostages' release. Charleston, with no naval force able to challenge 4 armed ships at its harbour mouth, complied. Teach released the hostages once the medicine arrived and sailed off, having demonstrated, to every port on the American coast watching the story travel, that a pirate fleet could hold a colonial capital hostage and simply leave unopposed. It was near the peak of this power, only weeks later, that Teach made the decision that historians still debate the full motive behind. He sailed the combined fleet to Topsail Inlet off North Carolina and ran Queen Anne's Revenge and a second ship deliberately aground, wrecking them. Some of his own men he then marooned on a nearby sandbar, keeping the bulk of the accumulated plunder for a much smaller circle rather than dividing it, by the numbers his articles would have required, among the whole crew. It looked to the men left behind like a betrayal, and it thinned his following considerably. Whether Teach did this to shed a crew that had grown too large to control, to consolidate wealth before seeking a pardon, or for reasons lost entirely to the record, the evidence suggests he understood the wind was changing. Word had already reached the colonies that the Crown in London was preparing an offer no pirate captain had yet been given outright: a pardon and a governor being sent specifically to end Nassau's decade as a lawless harbour for good. The pressure that produced this pardon had been building in London for years, not out of any sudden concern for the men themselves, but out of simple financial arithmetic. Every ship taken by a Nassau-based crew was a loss to a merchant house, an insurer, or the Crown's own customs revenue, and by 1717 the losses along the American and Caribbean trade routes had grown large enough that merchants with political weight in Parliament were demanding the Crown do something more than issue warrants that colonial governors lacked the ships to enforce. King George I responded in September of 1717 with a proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a royal official before a set deadline, initially the following September, for all acts of piracy committed before a certain date. It was an unusually generous offer, amnesty rather than punishment, and it came paired with a second decision, the appointment of a new royal governor for the Bahamas, specifically tasked with reclaiming Nassau. The man chosen for that post was Whydah Rogers, himself a former privateer with a genuinely remarkable record, having led a voyage around the world between 1708 and 1711, that, among other things, rescued a shipwrecked sailor named Alexander Selkirk, whose years alone on a Pacific island would later inspire the novel Robinson Crusoe. Rogers understood the men he was being sent to govern because he had commanded men very much like them. He arrived off Nassau in July 1718 with a small fleet of Royal Navy escorts and a printed copy of the King's Pardon, and rather than attempt to storm a harbour defended by 1,000 armed pirates with a handful of ships, he went ashore and simply had the proclamation read aloud and nailed up where every man in the town could see it for himself. The offer split Nassau's population precisely along the line one would expect: men who had accumulated enough plunder to want a legal life to enjoy it in, and men whose reputations were already infamous enough that a pardon meant little, since a colony's governor or a private bounty hunter might still come looking for them regardless of any royal proclamation's fine print. Benjamin Hornigold, Teach old captain, took the pardon and, in one of the era's stranger turns, was soon commissioned by Rogers himself to hunt down former colleagues who had not. Hundreds of other pirates accepted the terms and drifted into legitimate trade, privateering under a legal license once again, or simple retirement on whatever silver they had kept. For the first time in years, Nassau had a governor who could enforce order, a garrison to back him, and a growing population of former pirates, with every incentive to help him keep it that way. Edward Teach was one of the men who accepted the pardon, travelling to North Carolina in June 1718 and surrendering to that colony's governor, who by most accounts was not above quietly profiting from a relationship with a wealthy retired pirate living nearby. But a pardon accepted once did not bind a man to stay retired, and within months Teach was reportedly back at sea, trading in stolen goods and, by some accounts, resuming raids under the cover of his supposed reform. It was this return to piracy, after having already been offered and accepted the Crown's mercy once, that made him a priority target the moment Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, learned of it. Spotswood had no legal authority in North Carolina waters, but he decided the danger justified acting anyway, and dispatched a small naval detachment under a lieutenant named Robert Maynard to end the matter directly, at Blackbeard's own anchorage. In November of 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard sailed 2 small sloops, borrowed from Royal Navy vessels stationed at Virginia, since neither ship drew shallow enough water to enter the inlet themselves, toward Ocracoke Inlet off the coast of North Carolina, where Edward Teach lay at anchor with a much reduced crew, most of his earlier fleet lost to the deliberate wreck at Topsail Inlet months before. Maynard had no legal warrant to operate in North Carolina's waters at all, since Spotswood's authority as Virginia's governor stopped at his own colony's border, but the two men agreed the danger a rearmed Blackbeard represented to shipping up and down the coast was worth the risk of acting outside the letter of the law. Maynard's sloops carried no heavy cannons suited to the shallow, tricky channel around Ocracoke. This was going to be settled, if it came to it, hand to hand. Teach, by the accounts of survivors on both sides collected afterward, saw the approaching sloops and prepared for a fight rather than flight, reportedly drinking with Maynard's men across the water before the engagement began in a display of nerve as much as genuine friendliness. When the ships closed, Teach's crew fired first, a broadside that killed or wounded a significant portion of the men aboard Maynard's lead sloop. Maynard, in a tactic that would decide the outcome, ordered most of his surviving crew to hide below deck, making the ship appear undermanned and inviting Teach to board directly rather than continue firing from a distance. Teach took the bait, leading a boarding party across, and Maynard's hidden crew rose up as they came aboard, turning what had looked like an easy boarding into a close, brutal fight across the deck. Teach and Maynard fought each other directly in the melee, by Maynard's own later account exchanging pistol shots before closing with swords, Teach blade reportedly snapping Maynard's in the exchange before one of Maynard's crewmen struck, Teach from behind with a heavy cutlass blow to the neck. Teach fell, and by most accounts his crew, seeing their captain down amid a fight rapidly turning against them, surrendered soon after. Contemporary and later accounts describe Teach as having suffered a striking number of wounds by the fight's end, well beyond what killed him, evidence of how hard the final exchange had been fought on both sides. Maynard had his men cut off Teach's head and hang it from the bow of his sloop for the return voyage to Virginia, both grim proof for the bounty the Crown had placed on the pirates' capture and a deliberate, public warning to any crew that might consider following Teach's example. Teach's death removed the single most famous name still actively resisting the Crown's new arrangement. But it did not end the era, because Nassau's pardon had never persuaded every captain who called the harbour home. Some had simply refused the offer outright the moment Rogers arrived with it, judging their own crimes too notorious for any amnesty to protect them for long, or simply preferring the life they already had. Among the most defiant of these was a captain named Charles Vane, who had watched Rogers's fleet sail into Nassau harbour in 1718 and chosen, in the same hour most of the town accepted its pardon, to sail directly out. When Woody's Rogers fleet arrived off Nassau in the summer of 1718, Charles Vane had no intention of accepting the pardon on offer, and his response to the new governor's arrival became one of the era's most defiant single moments. Vane held a French merchant vessel he had recently captured, and rather than surrender it or abandon it, he set it ablaze at anchor and let it drift directly toward the Royal Navy warships anchored in the harbour entrance. In the confusion and the very real danger of a burning ship among wooden vessels loaded with gunpowder, Vane's own sloop slipped past the distracted warships and out to open sea, firing a defiant shot as he went, by most accounts without a single one of Rogers's ships managing to stop him. It was a piece of theatre as much as tactics, and it made Varna's name in a way few other actions could have. Once free of Nassau, Vane continued raiding along the American coast and through the Bahama Channel for another year and a half, but his authority over his own crew, the same consent-based system that had elected him, proved less durable than his reputation. In late 1718, Vane's sloop encountered a French warship considerably better armed than his own vessel, and Vane made the decision to flee rather than engage it, a choice that, under the articles most crews sailed by, was entirely his right as captain to make in the moment. His crew disagreed, judging the French ship's cargo worth the risk, and rather than simply grumbling, they exercised the same democratic mechanism that had put Vane in command in the first place. They voted him out. Command passed instead to Varney's quartermaster, a younger sailor named John Rackham, already known by the nickname Calico Jack for his preference for brightly patterned calico clothing over the more common sailor's canvas. Vane was not killed or imprisoned in this transition. The articles that governed pirate crews rarely called for that, against a deposed captain who had broken no rule beyond losing his crew's confidence. Instead, he was set adrift with a small number of loyal followers in a captured sloop, a demotion rather than an execution, consistent with how these crews generally handled internal disputes. Vane continued raiding on a smaller scale for a time afterward, but his luck ran out in early 1719 when a hurricane wrecked his ship on an uninhabited island. He survived the wreck itself, living for a period as a castaway before being picked up by a passing vessel whose captain, unaware of his identity at first, eventually recognized him. Vane was carried to Jamaica, tried for piracy, and hanged there in March of 1721. His body afterward displayed at Gallows Point as a warning to shipping entering the harbour, the same theatre of public deterrence that had already been used on Blackbeard's head and would be used again on the men who followed him. Command of Vane's old crew, and the reputation that came with defying Rogers' pardon so publicly, now belonged to John Rackham, a captain whose brief career would become notorious less for his own actions than for two of the people who chose to sail under his flag. John Rackham took command of Charles Vane's old crew in late 1718 and, like Vane before him, briefly accepted Whydah Rogers' pardon in Nassau rather than continue an immediately hopeless resistance, only to abandon that arrangement within months and return to raiding along the coasts of Jamaica and Cuba. Rackham's career as an independent captain was, by the standard of Teach or Vane, fairly modest, a string of small merchant sloops and fishing vessels, taken along routes he knew well rather than any dramatic blockade or fleet action. What made his crew exceptional, and what has kept his name remembered far longer than the scale of his actual plunder would justify on its own, were two of the people sailing with him disguised, for much of the voyage, as men. Anne Bonny had joined Rackham's crew after a personal relationship with him in Nassau, leaving behind a husband she had married there and a father in the Carolinas who had disowned her for it. She dressed in men's clothing aboard ship and, by testimony collected at trial, fought alongside the crew in combat rather than staying below in any protected role. Mary Read's path to the same deck was longer and stranger still. Raised from childhood, dressed as a boy by a mother, stretching a small inheritance meant for a different, deceased child, Read had served in the army, and later at sea disguised as a man for years before eventually joining pirate crews in the Caribbean, where she and Bonny became close. Whether purely as comrades or something more intimate, remains genuinely disputed among historians working from incomplete and often sensationalized period sources. Both women, by multiple accounts, were recognized by at least some of the crew as women, well before their true identities became public knowledge at trial, and neither appears to have concealed it particularly carefully once aboard. Rackham's sloop was finally cornered off the north coast of Jamaica in October 1720 by a privateer captain named Jonathan Barnett, sailing under a commission specifically to hunt pirates in local waters. The engagement that followed became, through surviving trial testimony, one of the most vividly documented single moments of the entire era. As Barnett's vessel closed and opened fire, most of Rackham's crew, by multiple witnesses' accounts, retreated below deck rather than fight, several reportedly too drunk to be roused for the engagement at all. Bonny and Red, by contrast, stood on deck and fought, firing weapons and, according to testimony that has become one of the most repeated details of the whole Golden Age, shouting down into the hold for the men hiding there to come up and fight like men, if there were any men below, worth the name. The sloop was taken with comparatively little resistance once its own crew had effectively refused to defend it. All three, Rackham, Bonny and Red, were tried in Jamaica in November 1720. Rackham was convicted and hanged, his body displayed on a small quay near Port Royal that still bears the name Rackham's Quay today. Bonny and Read were both convicted as well and sentenced to death, but both successfully petitioned to have their executions delayed on the grounds that they were pregnant, a legal reprieve English courts of the period generally honoured. Red did not survive to see any further outcome, dying in prison of a fever, possibly complicated by childbirth, in the spring of 1721. What became of Anne Bonny afterward is genuinely unresolved in the historical record. No execution record survives, and later largely unverifiable, family tradition claims she was quietly released and lived out a long life in the Carolinas, but historians treat that account as plausible at best rather than established fact. While Rackham's short and largely unremarkable career was ending on a Jamaican gallows in late 1720, the era's single most successful pirate captain was only beginning his rise, and he had come to piracy almost by accident. Bartholomew Roberts, a Welshman born John Roberts before adopting the name he became known by, was serving as third mate aboard a slave ship called the Princess when it was captured off the West African coast in June 1719 by a pirate crew under Captain Howell Davis. Davis, in a pattern common across the era, offered captured sailors a choice between joining his crew or being set ashore with nothing, and Roberts, reportedly reluctant at first, chose to join. He would later be quoted by the era's most detailed chronicler, reflecting that in an honest service the pay was low and the work hard, while in piracy there was liberty and power, and the only price was, in his words as recorded, a merry life and a short one. Whether the phrasing is exact or embellished by the source, the sentiment fits everything his subsequent career demonstrated. Within weeks of joining, Davis was killed in an ambush by Portuguese soldiers at Principe Island, and the crew, following the same consent-based tradition every flying gang crew had used, held a vote for a new captain. They chose Roberts, a man who had been aboard the ship for barely 6 weeks, over sailors who had served far longer. A decision historians attribute to a combination of Roberts' evident intelligence, his navigational skill, and a personal bearing his crew judged trustworthy even that early. It proved to be one of the more consequential votes any pirate crew ever cast. Roberts governed himself with a degree of personal restraint, unusual among his contemporaries. Multiple period accounts describe him drinking little compared to most of his crew, preferring tea to rum, and dressing with notable richness, a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a gold chain and diamond cross taken from a captured prize, a hat with a red feather, a deliberately cultivated image of command rather than mere plunder-seeking. He forbade gambling among his crew, a rule several other captains had also written into their articles for the same practical reason, and he insisted on discipline in a manner that, while not gentle, was consistent and evidently effective, since his crew's cohesion held together across a genuinely extraordinary run of captures. Over a career that lasted under 4 years before its end in 1722, Roberts is credited by historians, working from insurance claims, court records, and contemporary newspaper reports across the Atlantic world, with capturing somewhere in the range of 400 vessels, a figure that, if accurate even approximately, makes him by volume of captures the most successful pirate captain in recorded history, well beyond Blackbeard's or Vane's more famous but comparatively modest tallies. He raided along the coast of Newfoundland through the Caribbean, along the coast of Brazil, where he captured an entire Portuguese treasure fleet's flagship in a single daring strike, and eventually along the West African coast, where his final and most audacious campaign and his final battle would both take place. Roberts governed his growing fleet, which by 1721 numbered several ships and hundreds of men, under a set of articles more detailed and more strictly enforced than most that survive from the era, preserved in the trial records taken after his death, and later published in Charles Johnson's contemporary history of the period's pirates. Every man had an equal vote in matters of importance and equal access to fresh provisions and strong liquor as they came available, a deliberate levelling written into the very first article. Any man who deserted his post in battle, or who defrauded the company of even a small amount of plunder, was subject to marooning, left on a deserted shore with only a bottle of water, a firearm and a small amount of powder, a punishment severe enough to function as the crew's ultimate deterrent short of execution. Gambling for money or cards was banned outright. Candles were to be extinguished by 8 at night, with any man wanting to drink past that hour required to do so on the open deck rather than below. Again a fire safety measure as much as a discipline one. Striking another crew member aboard ship was punished on the spot. Any quarrel between 2 men was to be settled ashore, with pistol and sword, under the quartermaster's supervision, rather than allowed to fester and disrupt the ship at sea. And in a rule that stood out even among other crew's articles, no boy or woman was to be brought aboard the ship in disguise, a rule enforced according to the account that survives, with genuine severity following a specific incident the crew judged had nearly caused a serious breakdown of discipline. The wounded were compensated on a fixed scale before any general division of plunder, the loss of a limb or an eye earning a set sum drawn from the company's common fund, the same practical insurance principle other crews had built into their own articles years before. Musicians who had been taken or recruited aboard, several pirate crews of the era kept fiddlers or other musicians for morale, were entitled to rest on the Sabbath but could be called to play at any other time the crew demanded it. A small, oddly specific detail that survives only because it was written down. It was under this system that Roberts staged his most audacious single raid in January 1722 at the port of Whydah on the West African coast, then one of the busiest hubs of the transatlantic slave trade on that stretch of coastline. Roberts brought his fleet into the harbour and found 11 separate slave ships anchored there, loading or awaiting cargo, vessels belonging to English, French and Portuguese merchants alike. Rather than fight ship by ship, Roberts' reputation alone did most of the work. Ship after ship in the crowded anchorage surrendered without resistance once Roberts' black flag was recognised, and by the end of a single morning he had effectively taken control of the entire harbour's shipping, extracting ransom from some captains to leave their vessels and cargo untouched, and simply seizing others outright. It was one of the largest single captures of the entire Golden Age, and it was accomplished, by every surviving account, without a shot fired in anger. News of a raid this size, striking directly at the region's most lucrative trade, could not be ignored in London. The Royal Navy, already under pressure from merchant losses across the Atlantic for years, now had a specific target whose scale of damage justified a specific, dedicated response, and a fast, well-armed warship named HMS Swallow, under a captain named Challoner Ogle, was dispatched to the West African coast with orders that amounted to finding Bartholomew Roberts and ending his career by whatever means necessary. Challoner Ogle brought HMS Swallow along the West African coast through early 1722, tracking reports of Roberts' fleet, and he found his opening near Cape Lopez, on the coast of what is now Gabon, in early February. Roberts' fleet at the time held 3 ships anchored together, and Ogle, recognizing that a direct approach would likely see all 3 flee or fight together with combined firepower, used deception instead. He sailed Swallow away from the anchorage in a manner designed to look like a merchant vessel retreating from danger, drawing one of Roberts' ships, the Ranger, out in pursuit alone, away from the other 2. Once clear of the others and in open water, Ogle turned Swallow to fight, and its superior firepower as a proper naval warship overwhelmed the Ranger after a battle of roughly 3 hours, forcing its surrender. Ogle then returned to Cape Lopez to deal with Roberts' 2 remaining ships, the flagship Royal Fortune among them, still unaware that their consort had been lost. Roberts himself was aboard when Swallow reappeared, and by several accounts had been eating breakfast, a meal of boiled salmagundi, a mixed dish common aboard ships of the period, when the alarm was raised. He came on deck dressed, as was his habit even in the middle of a fight, in his finest clothing, the crimson damask waistcoat, the gold chain, the feathered hat, evidently by design. Multiple accounts attribute to him a standing preference, expressed to his crew beforehand, to die in his fine clothes rather than be captured and stripped of them for a public hanging. Early in the engagement that followed, before the battle had gone far, a blast of grape shot from Swallow's guns struck Roberts directly in the throat, killing him almost instantly at the helm. Roberts had, by account of his own crew's later testimony at trial, given clear standing instructions for exactly this circumstance. If he were killed in battle, his body was to be weighted and thrown into the sea rather than allowed to fall into the Navy's hands, both to deny the Crown the public spectacle of displaying his corpse and, in a more personal sense, to keep his body from the indignity his enemies would otherwise have arranged for it. His crew carried out that order in the middle of the ongoing battle, weighting Roberts' body with chains or shot and dropping it overboard, ensuring that unlike Blackbeard's head or Vane's body, no part of the era's most successful pirate would ever be publicly displayed at all. Without their captain, and facing a warship they could not outfight, the remaining crew surrendered shortly afterward. Ogle now held, across the 2 captured ships, close to 270 surviving crew members, by far the largest single haul of pirates taken alive at once in the entire Golden Age. Rather than attempt to transport such a number back to England for trial, a logistical impossibility given the space and provisions available, Ogle brought them instead to the nearest secure English installation on the coast, Cape Coast Castle, a fortified slave trading post belonging to the Royal African Company, where a trial on a scale the era had never seen and would never see again was about to begin. The trial that opened at Cape Coast Castle in March and April of 1722 processed close to 270 men in a matter of weeks, a scale of legal proceeding against pirates that no court before or after in the era approached. The court, made up of Royal African Company officials and naval officers, sitting as judges under a special commission, worked through each man's case individually, weighing testimony about the degree of each defendant's participation, whether he had joined willingly or been forced aboard after his own ship's capture, and whether he had shown any of the mercy toward captives that could weigh in his favour. It was, by the standard of many colonial trials of the period, a notably methodical process, if not always a lenient one. Of the men tried, 52 were sentenced to death and hanged, most in small groups over successive days rather than all at once, their bodies afterward tarred, a preservation technique that also made a corpse hold its shape longer in tropical heat, and displayed at prominent points along the coast, at Cape Coast Castle itself and at other harbour towns nearby, left hanging in public view for an extended period as a deliberate warning to any sailor who might otherwise consider Roberts' example worth following. A number of others received lesser sentences. Several were sentenced to 7 years indentured servitude in the Royal African Company's own mines and settlements along the coast, effectively a form of forced labour scarcely less harsh than a prison term, and a smaller number were acquitted outright, generally men whose testimony convinced the court they had been forced into piracy against their will, and had taken no active part in raids. Among those tried, a small number of enslaved Africans who had been part of the ship's crews, some originally taken as cargo before being incorporated into the pirate company itself, faced separate and often harsher treatment, a grim reminder of how thoroughly the transatlantic slave trade Roberts' fleet had preyed on at Whydah was itself woven into the wider Atlantic world these trials took place within. The court's records of these cases are less complete than for the European crew members. A gap in the historical record historians studying the trial have specifically noted rather than glossed over. The sheer scale of the Cape Coast Castle trial, and the public, coordinated display of the bodies afterward along a stretch of the very coast Roberts' crew had so recently dominated, sent a message the Royal Navy and its supporting merchants had been trying to send for years without quite achieving this level of impact. Piracy on this scale now carried a real, demonstrated and organised cost. It did not end the era on its own. Other captains, less famous than Roberts but still actively raiding, remained at large across the Caribbean and the American coast through the following several years. But the largest, most successful, and most feared pirate fleet the Golden Age had produced no longer existed, its captain's body already lost to the sea, its crew scattered between the gallows, the mines, and the small mercy of an acquittal, and the remaining captains of the era were now being hunted with a coordination and a resourcing that had simply not existed a decade earlier. In the years following Roberts' death at Cape Lopez, the remaining well-known captains of the Golden Age were run down one after another, in a pattern that had become, by the mid-1720s, distinctly less random than it had been a decade before. Edward Lowe, whose reputation for violence toward captives exceeded almost every other captain of the era, including a documented willingness to torture and mutilate prisoners well beyond what most cruise articles or common practice condoned, continued raiding the American coast and the Caribbean into 1723 and 1724, but his own crew eventually turned against him, reportedly marooning him after a dispute, and his ultimate fate is genuinely unresolved. Some accounts have him captured and hanged by the French, others simply lost at sea, and historians have not been able to confirm either version with confidence. John Phillips, a former ship's carpenter who turned to piracy and briefly commanded his own small crew along the New England coast, under articles closely modelled on the ones Roberts' men had sworn to, met an end almost fitting for the era's diminishing returns. Several of his own recently captured prisoners, forced aboard against their will rather than volunteers, turned on him during a scuffle in 1724 and killed him themselves, ending his short career not through a naval battle but through a mutiny by the very captives his crew had pressed into service. William Fly's career was shorter still, barely a few months in 1726, but his end became one of the era's most remembered final scenes, precisely because it happened not at sea or on some distant coast, but in Boston itself, a major colonial port, where his public execution drew a large crowd and a great deal of contemporary newspaper coverage. Convicted after his crew was overpowered following a mutiny of their own captives. Not unlike Philip's fate, Fly was reported by multiple witnesses to have shown no remorse at all on the scaffold, refusing the last rites offered him, and, by the most repeated account of the day, kicking the executioner's stool out from under himself rather than let the hangman do it, a final act of defiance that period newspapers seized on, and that later writers, including Charles Johnson, folded into the growing mythology of the unrepentant pirate. What made these final captures different from the hunt for Teach or Vane years earlier was not any single more dramatic battle, but the machinery surrounding them. By the mid-1720s, colonial governors coordinated more closely with the Royal Navy than they had in 1715. Insurance underwriters in London pushed merchant vessels towards sailing in escorted convoys rather than alone, and the easy, ungoverned harbours that had once let a captured ship's crew simply vanish into a town like early Nassau no longer existed in the same form anywhere in the Atlantic world. The individual captains who continued the trade after Roberts' death were, in effect, operating in a system that had been rebuilt specifically to make what they were doing far harder to sustain than it had been only a decade before. The golden age of piracy did not end because pirates suddenly ran out of ships worth taking, or because the sea grew safer on its own. It ended because the specific conditions that had created it in 1713 and 1715, an idle, skilled naval workforce and an ungoverned harbour to organise them in, were both deliberately and systematically closed off by the very governments that had, without meaning to, created them in the first place. The labour glut that had put thousands of trained sailors on the docks, with nothing to do in 1713, did not last forever. Atlantic trade itself expanded steadily through the 1710s and 1720s as the colonies grew and shipping volume with them, gradually absorbing many of the same idle sailors into legitimate merchant crews, especially once wages on that side of the ledger began recovering from the immediate post-war glut. A man choosing between a hanging offence with a real chance of a violent death and a legal berth that, while still hard and poorly paid by later standards, at least kept him off a gallows, increasingly chose the legal berth as the years passed, and the economy that had shut him out in 1713 slowly opened back up. The naval response also grew far more serious and far better resourced than it had been in the years right after Utrecht. In the immediate aftermath of the war, colonial governors had few or no warships to call on at all, which was precisely why a wrecking crew like Henry Jennings could raid a Spanish salvage camp and sail away with total impunity in 1715. By the mid-1720s, the Royal Navy kept a standing, dedicated presence in American and Caribbean waters considerably larger than what it had maintained even during active wartime a decade before, a permanent peacetime commitment of resources that would have seemed extravagant to a government just emerging from over a decade of expensive continental war. Ships like HMS Swallow, purpose-built, and fast enough to hunt a pirate fleet on its own terms, rather than merely react to raids after the fact, simply had not existed in sufficient numbers in 1715, and the havens closed. Whydah Rogers Nassau, however imperfectly governed in its early years, held. Other potential havens along the American coast and in the Caribbean, watching what had happened to Nassau's holdouts one by one, generally declined to become the next lawless refuge for a fleet the Royal Navy was now actively hunting with dedicated, purpose-built resources. A pirate crew in 1725 had nowhere left resembling the Nassau of 1716, no town with 1,000 sympathetic neighbours, no beach to careen a hull in with a governor's blessing rather than his opposition. Every piece of the system that had made the Golden Age possible, the idle men, the ungoverned harbour, the absence of a dedicated naval response, had been one at a time deliberately dismantled by the same crown whose war had built it in the first place. In 1724, only 2 years after Bartholomew Roberts' death at Cape Lopez, a book appeared in London, titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, credited to an author calling himself Charles Johnson, whose true identity remains disputed among historians to this day, with some arguing he was in fact the novelist Daniel Defoe writing under a pen name, and others treating that claim as unproven speculation. Whoever wrote it, the book drew heavily on trial records, newspaper accounts, and interviews with sailors who had first-hand knowledge of men like Teach, Roberts, Vane and Rackham, and it became, almost immediately, the single most influential source for how the Golden Age would be remembered by every generation that followed. Many of the specific, vivid details that survive in popular memory today, Blackbeard's burning fuses, Roberts' crimson waistcoat, and Bonny and Mary Read's testimony on the deck of Rackham's sloop, come to us largely or entirely through this one book, written close enough to the events to draw on real witnesses, but also written, by most accounts, with an eye for a dramatic scene that occasionally outran what the surviving court records alone can independently confirm. Out of that single influential text, and the decades of theatre, engravings and later fiction that built on it, grew an image of piracy that has outlived almost everything about the actual, comparatively narrow window of years, roughly 1715 to 1726, in which it took place. Some of that popular image holds up reasonably well against the record. The black flag, the elected captains, the harsh but genuinely consent-based articles, all of these are documented in real trial testimony and real surviving copies of ship's articles, not invention. Other pieces of the popular image are far shakier. The buried treasure chest marked with a map and an X is very largely a later literary invention. No reliable account from the actual Golden Age describes pirates burying treasure and drawing a map to recover it, most plunder being coin, goods or ship's cargo rather than chests of gold doubloons, was simply divided and spent quickly, often in the same taverns the crews had sailed out of. Walking the plank, the image of a captive forced at sword point off a board extended over the water appears in almost no verified account from the period at all, and seems to be a later theatrical embellishment rather than a documented practice. When pirate crews of the record killed captives, which was itself less common than popular memory suggests, since dead witnesses caused their own legal complications and most crews preferred simply to rob and release, they did so by more mundane and less theatrical means. What the record does support, consistently, across the trial testimony, the ship's articles, and the frightened letters of merchant captains who survived an encounter and wrote home about it, is a genuinely unusual historical moment. For roughly a decade, a few thousand men who had been trained, used, and then discarded by the naval and mercantile institutions of two great empires built, on their own initiative, and largely out of their own experience of what those institutions had gotten wrong, a system of elected leadership, shared plunder and compensated injury that most of the legitimate ships sailing the same waters at the same time did not offer their own crews at all. It did not make them admirable by any modern standard. The violence, the slaving port raids, the genuine terror they inflicted on ordinary sailors and coastal towns were all real, and the record does not ask us to romanticize any of it, but it explains in plain material terms rather than myth why so many men chose that flag over the alternatives on offer, and why it took the crown that had created the conditions for their existence a full decade of dedicated, expensive, coordinated effort to finally take that flag down for good. The harbour that made it possible is a tourist town today. The flag that flew over it is a costume shop print. What is left, once the treasure map and the plank are set aside, is simpler and more durable than either. A vote, a wage scale that paid a lost eye something, and a decade in which that was, however briefly, enough to build a world on. By 1730, the sand quay off New Providence, where crews had once careened their sloops, sat empty most seasons, the tar pots cold. The pardon that Woodes Rogers had nailed to a post in 1718 was long gone, rotted or torn down, though for years afterwards sailors passing through Nassau said you could still find its nail hole in the wood if you knew where to look. The black flags that had flown from a dozen masts were ash or trophies in a magistrate's office by then, and the men who had sewn them were hanged, pardoned, or simply gone quiet, working a merchantman's deck under a captain they had not voted for. The war that had made them was 30 years in the past. The peace that unmade them held. What they had built for a decade in the gap between the two, a fleet governed by consent, a harbour with no crown, a code that paid a lost hussy the same as a lost hand, left behind more legend than law, a chest that was never found, a walk off a plank that likely never happened, a skull and crossed bones that outlived every man who sailed under it. The lamplight in the taverns of Nassau went out one captain at a time. What is left is the flag,